Thank you everyone for joining us today. My name is Jamie Watt. I lead the intellectual property and technology practice here at Harper Macleod. With me today, I have got my colleague Paula Skinner, who deals with investment and fundraising, particularly in relation to early stage companies, and is one of our senior partners in our corporate team. And also on the call, Paul Chapman from Marks and Clerk, patent and trademark attorneys who I've known for as many years as I can remember, who deals with patenting specifically in areas of relation to biotech, life sciences. It's also eminently able to comment on other areas relating to patenting as they come up. So we're here to talk to you in relation to what is innovatively titled Seaweed, Salmon and Submarines, but it is a general chat around research and innovation in relation to the marine economy and what each of us are seeing in this area. Generally, it's going on these days. Some housekeeping, first of all. Questions are very much encouraged. You will see, for those of you that haven't used this before, down at the bottom of your Zoom screen, a facility to enter the chat. If you have a question for any of the panelists today, please just drop it into the chat box. For those questions which we can answer as we go along, we will pick them up as we go along. Some we may answer at the end, depending on the question. And of course, some may require a more detailed chat offline, but our contact details in that respect will also be included in an email following up with the attendees after this presentation. So there are no fire drills, except those that apply in relation to your own places of residence. If I have a fire here, you will see me depart fairly quickly. The same goes for the rest of the panelists, but hopefully that is not going to be the case. But if we kick off now, I'm going to start covering off a few things, first of all, in relation to some general economic and regulatory and commercial changes which have come up over the last couple of years and which affect the research and innovation market landscape in relation to the marine economy. I'll then pass over to Paul, who will chat through some trends that he's seeing in the patenting area. And then to finish off, we'll move across to Paula to chat through what she's seeing in the investment landscape. So I suppose the most obvious thing to mention in relation to the marine economy, to the economy generally over the last few years, which crystallised at Christmas time, is the UK's exit from the European Union. That will have certain consequences on the research and innovation landscape in relation to what people may be doing at this point in time, or what people may be planning to do going forward, in relation to what people are doing with EU funding streams, and in relation to EU companies. The other consequence that it's going to have, of course, is in relation to areas, countries, territories outside the UK. Now, we're in a process, early stages in the process of agreeing new trade deals. You may have seen in the press recently a trade deal coming up in relation to Albania, a country which is not entirely prominent in the marine economy, and a trade deal which largely replicates what we had as a consequence of being a member of the EU recently. But perhaps the more important trade deal that has been agreed in the last 6 months has been the deal between the UK and Japan. Now, this trade deal particularly, along with any other trade deals which are to come, will affect how easy it is to access a market. And that may include the market for research and development. It may include the market for the provision of consultancy services. It will have likely impact upon protocols for exchanging data, including personal data, and a whole manner of other things, including all the straightforward trade aspects of getting goods into other countries. Now, turning to the Japanese deal, that has particular provisions on the free flow of data, personal data protection. So if you're operating a business which may have interests in the Japanese market, then your ability to gather and interact with customers in that locality, your ability to carry out research which may involve the gathering of personal data, is going to be facilitated by the implementation of that trade arrangement. So it's useful to remember Japan as a market where you may want to look at expanding research and innovation activities which involve the collection of data. In the near future, there are certain provisions within that trade agreement that's going to make operating those sort of projects a lot easier. Another area which Japanese trade deal affects is in relation to localization requirements. Now, countries generally, if you're looking at carrying out a business in their particular territory, will often implement a requirement for you to have a local office, a local presence, for want of a better phrase, some sort of real and effective commercial establishment. There are implications in relation to the EU, which I'll come on to shortly, where that is something you may need to consider if you're wishing to continue with research and innovation activities. But where we have trade deals going into place, and particularly in relation to Japan, there have been certain provisions which have been brought in, which are avoiding the need for UK operators to have a local presence in Japan and vice versa, to allow them to enjoy the benefits of being able to operate in that market. Similarly, this applies to the requirement for local operating license. There are processes in the UK-Japanese trade deal which streamline the ability for UK companies, UK operators, to obtain local operating licenses. Now, these could be licenses which cover off anything in relation to the conducting of research projects, but also allowing the sale of products onto the market in Japan. So it's important to remember that as Japan goes for a market, the presence of a trade deal at this point in time is bringing some benefit in looking at that country in relation to a particular area to expand into. We also have more flexible rules around origin, which is an important aspect of being able to supply goods into a particular market. There are provisions around tariff-free access to the Japanese market. There are provisions surrounding protection of geographical indications, and there are also some beneficial provisions surrounding employment and mobility. So at this point in time, if you're looking for places to expand overseas because the EU may be becoming slightly more difficult, then Japan certainly is a good bet at this point in time. Now, turning on to the EU, probably one of the biggest impacts that the UK's departure from the EU will have is upon research funding access. There is some talk about replacement of EU funding streams with UK funding streams. The EU's 95 billion research programme Horizon Europe, we will still, as the UK, be able to participate in the Horizon Europe programme, but the terms relating to that remain to be negotiated at this point in time. So it's a bit of a moving feast. It is hopeful that UK-based researchers will be enjoying associate country status along the lines of what Switzerland, Norway, and 14 other non-EU countries have at this point in time. And that associate country status will effectively guarantee many of the same rights as EU members will have in relation to Horizon Europe. Horizon Europe is probably a bit of a special case in that we're continuing as the UK to participate in that. Other areas where you may be receiving funding in or have done in the past: European structural funding, European Social Fund, European Regional Development Fund. All of that will go and be replaced by new UK funding. So if you've been enjoying benefits under those schemes in relation to your research and development activities over the past few years, it is an area which you're going to have to look at what's going to come up in the UK in replacement for that. Specifically in relation to the marine economy, the European Maritime and Fisheries Fund, access to that is going to disappear as a consequence of our exit from the EU. So that's one area where we're seeing people paying a bit of attention and looking at strategy alongside markets outside the EU. Another consequence of our departure from the EU will be looking at localization. Certainly to conduct certain activities on a continual basis in the EU, you may need an EU local presence. So we're seeing an uplift, particularly in certain areas of companies that are heavy in personal data or data gathering, data exploitation, looking at setting up operations within the EU that can act as a particular point of contact for data matters, and can act as a particular point of contact to allow them to access streams of funding and other projects which, remaining solely in the UK, may no longer be possible. So a localization is another area that you probably will want to look at going forwards in relation to our departure from the EU. Now, another area, moving away from the realms of international trade for a second, that we're seeing a lot of research and development activity, is in relation to, I suppose, societal change, but also due to dwindling stocks of raw materials. And that's a move from oil and gas to renewables. We're seeing significant growth in research and development, particularly data-related activities in the renewable industry. We're seeing particular growth in relation to businesses employing technology in relation to supporting the renewables industry. We're seeing a move away from traditional oil and gas related technology development, perhaps into areas of greater enhancement of dwindling stock exploitation, but also into remediation and technologies which may help the oil and gas industry exit traditional means of exploitation. So that's another area where we're looking at things. I'm going to touch again briefly on data. Data is a big area in relation to all aspects of the marine economy. In relation to Scotland, not least through the city region deal in Edinburgh in the south, for data-driven innovation, we're looking at a lot more interest in big data and how that is applied to the marine economy. Now, that can be anything from logistics and shipping. It can be into the efficacy and development of vaccines and aquaculture technologies. And it can be into the development of know-how and consultancy services in relation to the development of technologies for other countries. We maybe as a country lag behind a wee bit in building infrastructure, the exploitation of fishing stocks and things like that, fish farms. Other countries, particularly in Scandinavia, the Far East, may be further ahead in putting actual concrete facilities into place. And that's perhaps maybe too as a consequence of having perhaps less regulation in that area, perhaps more investment over the past decades into that area, where we're finding the ability for the UK and Scotland to participate in that by provision of expert resource and consultancy. We're seeing people organizations where they're looking at innovation and knowledge to take forward what they're doing on the ground, accessing some of the skills that are available in Scotland. And those skills are often built upon strong know-how, strong learning, strong research, and the gathering of data in relation to what can be used in those areas. An area in relation to that, which is potentially an area for growth, relates to the carbon credit industry. And I know a question was raised in yesterday's presentation in relation to this. Now, the carbon credit industry onshore is becoming more established. Offshore, it is less established at this point in time, but validation of the particular data, how much carbon can be captured and sequestrated in marine resources, is a particular opportunity at this point in time. There is a lot of discussion, particularly in the US, other parts of Europe, in relation to the use of things like seaweed forests for sequestrating carbon. It's not there yet in this country, but I would guess over the next couple of years that is something which is going to move forward. So if you're looking for opportunities to gather data, create validation strategies, create standards and build businesses around that, that is a very strong area to look at this point in time. Now, we've touched on a few areas there. Of course, working in these areas, particularly in R&D, comes with a certain level of risk. Now, alongside picking up on these opportunities, an area where we're helping clients work out strategies at this point in time is ascertaining risks in going into these new markets, risks in going into these areas. And those risks can come in the form of identifying local peculiarities, for example, trading in the Far East or Japan. The risks can come in relation to competition. The risks can come into carrying out proper diligence on what other people are doing. The risks can come in relation to adoption. You can have the best technology in the world, but if the market is moving to adopt a competing technology, the investment that you're making in that area may be something which is wasted. So diligence on the technological landscape is an area where we're looking at things quite significantly. Against that background, fitting into the societal economic changes, the regulatory changes, the commercial changes, by helping clients, in essence, determine where to go in the world outside of the EU. And against the background of that comes their IP strategies and the costs involved with that. Now, a big part of building your IP strategy, as I mentioned just then, of course, is being aware of what other people are doing in areas of technological protection. A big area of technological protection involves patents. And in that respect, I'm now going to pass over to Paul to chat through what he's seeing on the patenting landscape and areas where you might want to be doing a bit of diligence if you're carrying out work to see what else is going on. Paul, over to you.
Thank you very much, Jamie. Just give me a thumbs up that you can hear me. Yep, thanks. Good. Yes, well, thank you for that. And that was a very nice segue into what I'm going to discuss today. Jamie mentioned at the beginning, we've known each other a long time. He's being a little bit coy there. I've known Jamie since he was a little boy because I actually went to school with his elder brother. How bizarre it is that we should both end up actually in the field of IP. But there you go. So as Jamie said at the beginning, so I've been a patent attorney for over 25 years now. I've seen a lot of change in the industry. But what I've not seen change is in the will to innovate. And I always think sometimes this is a bit trite when people say, Scotland punches above its weight but actually it absolutely does when it comes to innovation. If you think of our size and you think of the great inventions throughout history that can be ascribed to Scots, it's quite significant. I mean, so, and I've always seen that, and I've always seen, as I say, that continuing development. Now, my background, as Jamie said, is more in the sort of the life sciences area, and I'll touch upon that. But for those of you who are not listening with that sort of background, I'll also be touching upon some of the other areas where we're seeing innovation. I've spoken to people in our energy team. But of course, just going back to sort of innovation and its importance and marine economy, that's what we're looking at. I mean, you'll appreciate that we are part of an island, and Scotland is effectively bounded by on three sides, if you look at in that sort of shape size, by water, and so the marine economy has always been a factor of sort of Scottish life and industry. Of course, historically, shipbuilding was one of those massive areas, and it is not really such a large area anymore. But that comes back to the innovation and the desire to change, and that's where Scotland, I think, has its strength, and has certainly moved on from shipbuilding to to other industries, and that's important. Coming back to sort of aquaculture first, it's interesting because I actually wrote a brief article for an internal magazine that our firm produces called Scran and Sips, very Scottish focused, looking at the sort of food and drink industry in Scotland. And I wrote an article only a couple of months ago about aquaculture and innovation. And when I was researching for that, there was a couple of interesting things that I just didn't know about when I was researching it. So salmon farming, for example, is worth something like £900 million, and this was a 2018 figure to the Scottish economy. Not insignificant. And yet everyone knows some of the issues that are surrounding salmon farming in terms of disease to the fish, in terms of environmental impact for sort of broader than that, the wild fish, etc. So we have to be very careful in terms of how we manage that. And certainly there's a significant amount of innovation in relation to that. And I'm going to talk about a couple of things that I was actually involved with. But the other interesting figure that came out when I was looking at this was 70 years ago, apparently only 3% of all aquatic production, so that was just fishing, was through farming itself. And now apparently that's exceeded 50% of the fish that we eat. So 50% is now farmed as opposed to 3% 70 years ago. So that's really quite significant and shows the importance of farming. And of course, we see that as being important in Scotland. So we have to, as I say, manage that well. So one of my clients invented what they called the Foover, Foover, play on the term Hoover, and it was a remotely operated underwater vehicle that integrated a suction device, and it's literally designed to be used within fish farms to get rid of diseased and dying fish. You could probably instantly understand why you need to get rid of diseased fish because they will infect other fish. But actually, people don't realize as well, fish are a bit cannibalistic. So actually, if you leave the dead or dying ones, they will get eaten by the other fish. So there's a real importance to get rid of those fish from the aquaculture netting as quickly as possible. And they came to us, and we have patented that device for them. So that's at the one scale, and that's not normally what I do. It's a mechanical device. On the other end of what I've really, and this is more what I do on a sort of day-to-day basis, is actually looking at the sort of the vaccines type work in relation to trying to vaccinate fish against disease, as well as treatments. And the other area that really is sort of going to develop, and there has been significant work in Scotland, is actually in terms of breeding. And so, without going into the details of the sort of genetic backgrounds, but you'll find that certain fish are more resistant to disease than other fish, and there's a genetic component to that. And so if we can identify the genetic components that are associated with that resistance, and you can breed that resistance into the fish so that they will, and that gives you a sort of a natural way that they'll be resistant. So you don't need to use nasty chemicals, and you don't need to vaccinate. And obviously some people have some concerns with vaccination, and it's a very costly process. So I see fish breeding as being of quite big significance. And that's not just in terms of salmon in Scotland, which is a big player. They're looking at other farmed fish, such as tilapia, such as shellfish. Obviously, we have a lot of wild shellfish. That's how we grow them in Scotland. But in other countries of the world, they massively farm prawns, for example, in the Far East. And there's definitely a lot of significant work going on there. The other area in terms of the sort of the biological aspects, it wasn't so long ago, and I'm saying I think probably about 50 years, unless I'm getting that wrong, that there was farms for seaweed in Scotland. I don't think there's a serious farming of seaweed anymore, maybe on a very small scale. But seaweed, was used to make alginates and agar and the like. But there's definitely a lot of people looking at extracting high value products from seaweed and other materials. Chitin, for example, from the shellfish carcass. These are things that people have innovated in and looking to develop in Scotland. As I said, I did ask my colleagues in our energy group how they are seeing things, because obviously, and Jamie touched upon it, the oil industry, but that's seeing a transition, and how are they transitioning? What are they doing that's different? So I was advised that what's been quite interesting is that there's been a lot of talk about a drive towards energy transition. And what I mean by that is that offshore operations are looking to lower their carbon footprint. And so they're looking at things like electrification of vehicles, the ships that are going out to the oil rigs or to the offshore renewables, etc. People are looking at ways that they can make those greener. Of course, it would be foolish or foolhardy not to mention the advances in terms of offshore wind, and the innovations there include the hardware, but also methods of installing. We're in a particular area, and installing these platforms, etc., in the sea and deep sea is problematic, and we have experience from doing that in the oil platform scenario, and maybe some of that is coming to play in terms of the wind generation. So people are looking at that, and how you connect to the grid. There's a massive amount of work there. What I was surprised about, we've done a lot of work as a firm in advising people in relation to AI and machine learning, and I was surprised to learn that that's actually a big area in terms of this industry as well. People are using it to see if they can increase efficiency of wind farms, for example, using it to predict better wind conditions, sourcing of spare parts when that's all required. It's as I say, these are not areas that I routinely work in, and so I was quite surprised and interested to hear that these are the things that people are looking at. How they manage vast volumes of data that Jamie was talking about. There's lots of data in terms of wind farms, in terms of how they capture that wind and et cetera. And the people are looking at that to try and improve its use going forward. The other one I'll briefly touch on is the advancements in 3D printing. And again, we've told a lot of people about the issues in terms of IP and people that have 3D printing patents, and something that you should be sort of careful about. But what I was advised was that people were looking to move 3D printing parts offshore. So rather than having to transport parts from shore to your, be it your oil rig or your wind farm, people are actually using the 3D printing directly, so that you're cutting down on that transport. which is great and obviously lowers carbon footprint. But as I say, it does open up issues in terms of whether or not you'd infringe anyone's IP, and people seem to sort of forget almost sometimes that printing something offshore does not necessarily mean that you'll avoid infringing IP. And that's where I'll come down to my last part. I know that Paula is going to be talking about the importance of IP in terms of finance models, etc. And I've been talking about filing patents there. I'll give you an idea of areas that people are working in. And obviously people file patents in order to generate value to the company. And sometimes that is the only value, in a sense. That intellectual value is in the company. There's no bricks and mortar. Technology companies, everything could be about their IP. But the one thing that I would suggest that people don't forget, and this is what I often get when people are looking at for financing, and they're going to be talking to a investment house or whatever, is that you must be prepared for what's called freedom to operate. Very briefly, I could do a whole hour lecture, not 2 minutes on this, but it's not just about what you do, it's about what other people do. And to back up what Jamie was talking about on due diligence, what I see that often is people don't do enough in terms of knowing what other people have protected and understanding how they can get around their patents or how they don't infringe those patents. And so as much as investors will ask, what IP do you own? And in a sense, put a value there. Equally, the investors are often wanting to know, do you infringe anyone's IP? Because they do not want to invest in you if the first thing that's going to happen is that someone's going to knock on your door and say, and issue a writ for infringing their IP. So if it's a one take-home message that I want to get to people, is not just about developing your own IP, it's getting that freedom to operate. And that's something that we assist clients with all the time, as well as I'm sure Paula and Jamie do to an extent as well. So that's my segue to Paula and letting her perhaps talk about her site and her vision of investment and IP.
Great. Thanks, Paul. So Paula Skinner, for those who don't know me, I head up the entrepreneurial team within Harper Macleod and predominantly work with startups and scale-up businesses looking to raise funding, mainly equity funding. So I'm going to talk about a couple of areas today. I'm going to talk about investment generally and how that impacts some statistics around marine. Kind of touching on from what Paul and Jamie have both said around the areas in marine where we're seeing things and what has been attractive for investors. A little bit around sources of funding from public and private grants, equity, debt, and then wrapping up on what type of things investors might want to see and what we're seeing become increasingly important from an investor's perspective, as you've just heard particularly from Paul there. So, Paul mentioned about particularly Scotland punching above its weight in terms of innovation. The UK generally is leading the way as the European home of technology investment, but the investment's actually happening across the whole country. It's not just London-centric, which it has been in previous years. So in recent times, Glasgow saw one of the largest percentage increases in funding, according to a recent report that I saw by British Venture Capitalist Association. But as I'm sure you're aware, Edinburgh is an absolute key player in the global tech market, and a lot of the marine investments that we are seeing would also technology or oil and gas, renewables, etc. But they've got a marine slant. That's actually what I'm seeing is they don't necessarily always see themselves as a marine investment, play towards whatever seems to be the sexy time, like just now space, investments in the space sector are really attracting a lot of interest from investors, etc. So businesses that have got an angle on them are actually classing themselves maybe as space or maybe as something a little bit more detailed. So I'm just seeing here, can Jamie and Paul thumbs up if you can hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you fine. Yeah, that's fine.
Okay. So Okay, any problems, just give me a thumbs up, something saying they're struggling to hear. That's a bit better now. So, as I said, I think that's one of the challenges actually, is getting businesses and entrepreneurs to see themselves as marine investments, maybe rather than the technology or the space. And actually, because the UK is the second leading country in the world for maritime technology startups, only behind the US. Like I said, I just don't think that entrepreneurial businesses are badging themselves necessarily as marine or maritime. So the areas where we're seeing things happen, we kind of touched on them already, but from an investment point of view, it's oil and gas. Given the economics of the sector at the moment, from a less oil, lower price, investors are looking at companies that can supply technology which can reduce costs. So that can offer maybe, for example, better maintenance solutions like remote operated submarines. And Paul touched on some technologies that he'd been seeing about making things greener and reducing carbon footprint, etc. One of the key things that investors are looking at here are patent protection and really, really heavy diligence. On the renewable sector then, renewables related technologies have been a target for the last couple of years. Currently those that offer support solutions on planning, maintenance in existing farms, wind farms, etc. are a target. In previous years, early stage wave and wind device companies attracted interest, but those that are gaining more traction now are the types of investments that get a little bit more of a market recognition. We recently acted for a funder into Orbital Marine, which is the tidal energy company, and it was the money was used to build a floating turbine platform. So I'll talk about a little bit later on. But that was a 7 million raise, and we were acting for the funder in that transaction. And one of the key things there was diligence around all of the construction contracts and maintenance contracts, etc. So there's a lot of diligence on there. In the aquaculture sector, this is again, it's pretty investable at the moment, like areas like vaccines, as Paul mentioned. Countries like Norway that have already got a pretty advanced fish farming sector will look to countries like Scotland, where we're quite innovative in terms of the vaccines. There's also food sector, which we're seeing a lot of seaweed, salmon, fish products. As Jamie was mentioning, Japan, so Far East is a big market for that sector. We recently acted for a salmon fish farm and an investment from a European fish farming business. And then lastly, in technology, which tends to be the area that I work in the most, and it's interesting to hear Paul mention about artificial intelligence, data, 3D printing, etc. I've picked 3 examples of recent deals that we've been involved in that kind of that show the breadth of where we're seeing a marine angle. So first business is R3 IoT. They use satellite technology to connect the world's fish farms. So this is where the space element comes into it. So they could be seen as a space business, a technology business, a marine business, quite a lot of different sources of funding for them, because they attack a lot of different sectors. But what they do is they provide fish farmers with tools to improve stock survival rates, predictability, fish well-being, etc. So the farms no longer need to be remote, isolated operations, because their satellite technology allows them to have a constant and continuous link. So we've done quite a lot with R3 IoT over the years. It's a Glasgow-based startup, really exciting, really innovative, and it's probably one to watch, I would say, in the future. We recently acted as well last year for Par Equity, one of the UK Scotland's leading angel syndicate groups. So we were acting as an investor on that. So they were investing in a business called ECOG, based up in Aberdeen. and they've got an innovative battery storage system which is designed for subsea applications. So it aims to remove the need for undersea power cables. So back to what we were talking about earlier on, and Paul mentioned about looking for more cost-effective ways of doing things. This, like I said, removes the need for undersea power cables, and it's providing a solution at a fraction of the cost of the alternatives. So from an investor's point of view, in that this was Par Equity, Scottish Investment Bank, a number of other investors as well, and we carried out quite a lot of diligence around the intellectual. Jamie was quite heavily involved in that in terms of diligence, ensuring that the foundations were right, particularly around the IP. And the last example that I wanted to give under technology before we move on to sources of funding was a business that's using existing technology, kind of auction/eBay model, and they're bringing it into the marine sector, which has been quite interesting. So it's pretty novel to be bringing that sort of technology into this sector. So that's quite another exciting business that we've been working with on various things over the years, including. Moving on now to sources of funding. So, as I mentioned before, I typically work on the equity side of things. So businesses startups and scale up looking to raise equity funding. But as part of that, we get involved. We work with businesses at all stages of their life cycle. So we'll get involved with businesses and we'll speak to them about some of the grant funding that they're looking at. So maybe I've come across Interface. So Interface can fund R&D projects, and they fund things like seaweed businesses, and they've also funded fish vaccination solutions. So there's quite a broad range of R&D projects that Interface can fund. Jamie, I think, someone touched on the Argyll and Bute rural growth deal and the city deals that we're seeing more of. That's another source of funding that we just launched in February 2021, and the plans there are to develop the region into a national and international centre for excellence in aquaculture, innovation and research. There's also the Circular Economy Investment Fund, which is administered by Zero Waste Scotland. Again, maybe not something you would immediately think about from a marine point of view, but they mention the bioeconomy on their website, and they've funded an Ayrshire-based business that was producing a material to be used in industries like food and drink, textiles, pharmaceuticals, and the business is called Marine Biopolymers, and they take seaweed and turn it into a material that can be used in food and drink, etc. And then there's also Penotech, an Edinburgh-based business, which was the crustacean shell waste that Paul touched on earlier on. That's also been funded under the Circular Economy Investment Fund. I think they raised about £200,000, so they can use the crustacean shell waste, easy for me to say, into cosmetics, food thickening and surgical stitches. So again, it shows you some support, that funding available for the innovation there. And then lastly, it's a more traditional type of funding that's available from Scottish Investment Bank, the new Scottish National Investment Bank, the angel syndicates like Par Equity I mentioned. I mean, Jamie touched on Brexit, and obviously a lot of the deals that we are involved in that involve angel syndicates are EIS qualifying, which is a tax break. So it remains to be seen what happens post-Brexit around EIS. I mean, I think the economy in the UK is going to need stimulated more than ever. So hopefully whatever the replacement is for EIS and SEIS will replicate, because it's strong, it's really powerful for tax break to encourage investors to invest in risky technology. And then I also wanted to quickly touch on alternative funders. So some of you might know that Harper Macleod are the definitely Scotland's leading advisors on alternative finance, such as crowdfunding, crowd lending, etc. So we've got a couple of deals in the marine sector that I thought might be worth mentioning. So Orbital Marine, the tidal platform, they actually used crowdfunding twice. They used equity crowdfunding from Crowdcube when they raised 2.2 million from investors. And then the Abundance investment deal, which was the one I was talking about earlier, we were involved in. Abundance, for those who don't know, is a crowdfunding platform, but they invest in green and social projects. We've done quite a number of their Scottish deals, and they've done a number of tidal deals. But Orbital Marine, their largest deal to date, it is £7 million. They had 2,300 investors from all across mainly the UK. I think the average investment per individual investor was 3,000, but from investors local to the project, so those based in Scotland and near the Orbital Marine base, then that went from 3,000 to 4,500. So it just shows the proximity to the investors that increased the average investment percent. And that was a debt product that was 12% interest debenture, 2.5 years. And there's been another couple of crowds on the Cedar website and on the Crowdcube website. There's another couple of Scottish, I'm kind of conscious of time, deals that have raised equity investment. We're seeing more of the crowdfunding where it's mixed with the more traditional. So it's not just crowd, it's crowd, angel syndicate, Scottish Investment Bank, traditional bank. And it's quite a skill to pull all that together. And I think lastly then, as a round up from me, it's around the types of things an investor wants to see, and where we're seeing things. I think we've probably covered it all. I mean, it's about ensuring that a business's foundations are right and that their proper paperwork is in place around the IP, the diligence will be covered around technological landscape and other competitors. IP is covered. IP is a fundamental point, without a doubt, or in any of this. It's covered in employment contracts, it's covered in consultancy contracts, it's covered in assignations of IP. And I think if I can leave you with one point, it's about getting the foundations in place at an early stage, that we're not having these debates with an investor at the time you're doing an investment. That's all from me. Thank you. Thanks, Jamie.
Great. Thanks, Paula. That's very informative, and thanks, Paul, also for your input. I mean, I think if we just to sum up briefly what one should take out of that, I think it's all about strategy, a combination of your international strategy, your research strategy, how you're going to innovate, what projects you're going to get into, your data strategy, that's come out quite significantly in this, your general IP strategy around protection, but also freedom to use or freedom to do what you're doing, but also your funding strategy. And that is worth looking at both traditional, non-traditional alternative methods, that can help take your business forward to where you want to get to. I'm now going to open up for questions. Please feel free to drop them in the chat box, and I'm maybe going to kick off with one myself to both of you, Paula and Paul. Certainly when I'm dealing in brand expansion for companies, it's a good indicator of what countries they may think might be of use to them going forward. And I think, Paul, it'd be useful to see, I mean, if you're seeing anything from overseas coming into Scottish companies, what countries that's coming from. And Paul, as regards kind of patenting strategy, is that the same question out to yourself? What countries are you seeing of interest to people at this point in time? And one subsidiary question for Paul off the back of that, do you think us entering into the Trans-Pacific Partnership might make a difference in patenting strategy? But over to Paula first. How are you seeing kind of international interest?
I think we're seeing more interest from US investors than we've ever seen. I mean, I can't remember if I actually said this, but one of the statistics that I had was that, and I may have said this, but VC investment in the UK reached over 15 billion in 2020, more than Germany and France combined. So actually, UK generally, from an investment point of view, it still seems to be an attractive market, I think, because of the innovation. And a lot of that investment seems to be coming from North America. I think that's it probably, and from an investment point of view, it's mainly investors from North America coming to the UK to make investments. Seen a little bit from the Far East, but not as much maybe as we would have expected, and not much from other parts of Europe. It's mainly America.
Yeah, I mean, certainly from my point of view, I'm seeing the US crop up more often than Europe at this point in time. To an extent, Canada, Australia, and some growing interest in places like Singapore, Vietnam, Korea, and things like that. Paul, from the point of view of patenting strategies, how are you seeing kind of country coverage these days?
Well, it is sector specific. So just touching, so aquaculture, if that was where you were, then depending on your aquaculture, I mean, we've mentioned Norway. You would clearly be wanting to protect Norway, and Canada as well, in terms of if it was salmon production. But I touched upon the more sort of what we would call exotic fishes, tilapia and prawns. And then you would be wanting to protect in the Far East. But there is no one size fits all. I mean, people often come to me and say, where should I patent? It isn't as simple as that. You need to look at your market where you would like to market into, and you need to maybe consider your competitors and where they are based. And so, that's what drives it. You can't just, US is probably de rigueur. I mean, I can't think of any sort of technology where people aren't wanting to have a patent in the US because it's such a big market. But after that, interestingly, in the sort of the bioscience economy, 10 years ago, it was always US, Europe, and Japan. Now I would say it's US and Europe, and then if the money is an issue, more often than not, they'll choose China rather than Japan, and it's more due to an opportunity rather than anything else. So it gives you a sort of rough idea. Okay, great. Many thanks for that. Okay, great. I think we've got time for one more question, and again, over to the both of you. Historically, I've been a great believer in the benefits of interacting between, university and industry. It can be difficult. It has potentially got better in some areas over time. How are both of you seeing the level of interaction for commercial companies with universities, investment in university spin-out companies, things like that? Is this still a fertile area for growth, do you think? Or is it something where maybe the academic institutions are taking a more research-led and licensing-led rather than kind of spin-out or knowledge transfer approach to things? So maybe, Paul, over to yourself. Are you seeing as many spin-outs as you did? Sorry. Which one?
Paul. Yeah. So go for Paula first. Yeah.
Okay, fine. Yeah, no, actually, maybe if you'd asked me 6 months ago, I would have said no. But now it might just be by dint of what's on my desk. But we've quite a few spin-outs from various universities that we've worked with in the last 12 months or so. Nothing in this sector, though. But generally, some universities are better than others, quite frankly, at it. And some universities will move quicker and be more commercial and allow us to do something that, because what I'm thinking about when I'm doing a spin out is actually how do we ensure that this is investable at the next stage, and how do we make sure we can exit this at some stage, so we don't want to have something too restrictive at the beginning, which is can be easier said than done. But no, in terms of trends, I would say actually I'm probably more spin-outs at the moment than I have done. Whether that's general in the market, or just by dint of what's on my desk, but that's my view.
Yeah. Okay. Paul, over to yourself. How's the world of interaction with universities from your end?
It's a very similar story, which is interesting. Exactly what Paula was saying. I mean, a year ago, I wouldn't have said there was so much spin out activity. I don't know if it's a COVID factor, and because we've all been locked down at home, and maybe the academics have had more time to think about how they might develop something and have the desire to form a spin out. That's just maybe apocryphal, just the way I'm thinking, but there definitely has been a lot of that. I think it does depend on the technologies again, and it depends on the universities, as we probably know. I mean, I do a phenomenal amount of my work is university based, and some universities are more applied than others. And I would say, if we were looking at the sort of the real bio side, so back to the sort of vaccines or the fish breeding, etc., I think that's more the basic research and is more likely to be sort of licensable technology than necessarily forming a company. But who knows? But then the development of things in renewables and new devices or assisting in those fronts, that could easily be spin out formation.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's certainly from my point of view, over the course of the last year, I've probably done more work in university licensing on behalf of commercial companies, a variety of different areas, including, medtech software, innovative technologies to help things go forward than I have done in the last 3 or 4. People seem to be innovating potentially maybe more than they used to. I think it depends on the type of innovation and whether you can do this innovation from a laptop in your house, or whether you require access to a wave tank or something like that. I've seen projects in certain areas slow down because they've not been able to get out there and do the on-site in water testing that they need to do to take things forward. So it is a mixed bag, but I do think overall people are probably in that area innovating more than I've seen recently, and it's a good source for if you're operating a business in marine. If you're not, speaking with your local university, research establishment, it is worth making contact because, at the very worst, that you'll find out that there isn't anything that you can do for your business. But, that is generally probably not going to be the case. Excellent. Okay, well, I'm conscious we're hitting the end of the hour. So in summary, I'm just going to pass around Paula and Paul and myself and say, what would be if you wanted a person to take one lesson from today about research, development, innovation, intellectual property from your areas to help their business go forward? What would be that one message that you would give to them? Paul, maybe first you this time.
Well, keep innovating and don't be afraid to ask for advice. Don't assume that something has been done before. There may be ways that we can get round someone else's IP. But equally, as I say, if you have innovated, it's important to know if someone has done it before. So it works both ways. But just, keep inventing. Excellent.
Paula, over to you.
I think from my point of view, it's that there are a large number of forms of funding, and being open to them all and learn about them all, learn about alternative finance, because all forms of funding have got pros and cons with it. And as a sub point of that, it is ensure your business is prepared for as wide a variety of funding as it can be. Don't set yourself up so that you shut off one form of funding too early on. So I think that's my kind of takeaway from it, I think.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Paul. And from my point of view, I think those are both very useful points to inform the strategy for your business going forward. And that's the one thing I think is very much worth taking from today. Think about your strategy in all these different areas, because if you pull things together in one coherent way, then that is going to help your business going forward in marine and in any other area, to achieve what you want to achieve. I'd like to thank both our panelists for joining us today. We will distribute our contact details amongst attendees following on from this. As Paul said, take advice. Feel free to drop us an email and ask us a question, because we're here to help, and it's better to ask a question at the start and deal with a problem further down the line, we say. So thank you everyone for attending, and hopefully speak to some of you soon. Brilliant. Cheers.